All praises to the Most High, right? First and foremost, right? All praise to the Most High Yahweh, Bashim Yahushai, right? Shalom, 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 right? Shalom to the ancient men and women, the men in this truth, women in this truth, children in this truth that are enduring, fighting temptations, right? Doing what they need to do according to the scripture, to, Lord willing, gain that salvation, right? In the end, right? But able praise to the Most High again, right? We obviously have Passover coming up, right? Um, I get one precept on that, right? I really get one precept on that, because Passover is shortly upon us, right? So this is the book of Luke, chapter 22, verse 1. It says, "Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover." So, we have that coming up for us at Watchmen for Israel. Obviously, this is on the international channel, wherever we are in the world, right? That will be Wednesday the 1st at sundown, right? Wednesday the 1st at sundown, like it says in Luke 22 about the feast of unleavened bread, right? Which is called the Passover, right? That's going to be taking place at that point in time, right? But nonetheless, man, right? Um, Lord willing, we have to really be able to prove all things, man, and have to try and, I get a classic precept, right? I'll get a few precepts to start this off with, right? Because when it comes to proving the scriptures, we have to be able to, I'm gonna get, Lord willing, three preliminary precepts to kind of start this thing off. So let's get the book of Jude, chapter 1, and I'll start at verse 3. It says, "Beloved, when I gave all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write unto you and exhort you that ye should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints." So in this truth, don't just, are you trying to watch the breakdowns that brothers teach and then just, do no research or reading yourself. You have to be able to uh, um, break it down yourself, and you have to be able to defend the doctrine and contend for the faith. Someone asks you to prove something and you can't do it. You're trying to go back to the breakdown. You bringing up your phone and you're trying to. You have to be in this thing, contending for the faith, being able to prove this in history, being able to, kind of go into who wrote this, who's the author, who's it accredited to, right? So that's contending for the faith, right? That's what you should be doing. I'm gonna get another one. It's the book of Proverbs, chapter 24, right? Proverbs 24, and I'm gonna start at verse 3. Uh, Proverbs 24 and verse start 3. It says, "Through wisdom is an house builded." Right? Shalom, Don Israel, Tamid 7. It says, Proverbs 24 and 3. It says, "Through wisdom is an house builded, and by understanding is it established." So you to build up yourself even in the truth, or to defend the faith, contend for it, you have to be established. You don't just, you have to gather the certain materials to build yourself up, spiritually, literally, right? Certain things you may require, right? It says, reading on in verse 4, "And by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches." So that's how you're going to really build yourself up, when it comes to being a contender for the faith, someone that can defend the faith, someone that can go toe to toe. Not that we're out there to just debate and argue with people, obviously, just really to persuade, to break, um, like it says about long forbearing, princes are persuaded, in it, to break down these strongholds that people have in their minds. So we have to be able to do that, right? And that's through the establishing of wisdom that we attain ourselves to then be able to teach others, right? And I get one more classic precept, right? Right, it's the book of uh, Second Timothy, right? Chapter the book of Second Timothy, chapter 2, and I'll start from verse number 15. Yeah. The book of Second Timothy, chapter 2, and verse 15. It reads, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. But shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness." So evidently, you have to be in a mindset to what study, man, right? And prove what it is you study. Go to history. How does this line up, right? That's what we got to be able to learn to do, right? In this truth, man. Because again, profane and vain babblings could be you just copying and regurgitating what you've heard, but you ain't really proved it. You know, it's all good in watching breakdowns because that's what we should do, watch breakdowns. But you know, getting the context of a chapter is, you know, probably that's the better thing to know. What's going on in the chapter? What's the context of what's going on? What's the context of, you know, for example, I was reading today in the book of Ruth, you know, in the fourth chapter, you know, which is linked to um the laws of redemption, right? Like in Leviticus 25 and in Deuteronomy 25 as well, you know, where it speaks about, you know, the purchasing of land, and it will go to the near of kinsman. If there's not that near kinsman, then it be transferred to the next near of kinsman. So you have to understand, you know, what is this speaking about, you know, right? But nonetheless, man, I'm gonna get into it, right? So I got a few points down, right? Talking about the judges, man, right? The judges. So let's get the judges firstly. Um, it by you know, what's the word? Let me get one precept. This is Psalms. It's another classic. Psalm 68 and verse number 11. So like yeah, but Psalm 68 and verse 11. It says, "The Lord gave the word. Great was the company of those that published it." So the company meaning it wasn't just one person. It wasn't just King James. Anyone saying King James was he wrote the Bible, it's really low level scholarship, right? You haven't done your research. You just that's that vain and profane babbling. That's that appeal to common belief. Really a hearsay. This person said this is, they call it Chinese whispers. But where does it say King James wrote the Bible? Where does it say that? Just as he gave the authorization, you know, and you know allowed it to commence, right? But essentially, you know, it's by popular um accreditation. The Book of Judges, right? They say is accredited to Samuel, right? That's the common um, report by scholars. Some scholars claim that it, you know, they say it's anonymous, right? But and some actually even suggest that it's Isaiah, right? Which I don't know how they've come up with that, but from the research I've done, you know, the most popular one is obviously Samuel. Some scholars say it's an unknown author, and some, you know, one I've read as well has said also Isaiah. You know, but again, some of these things I will obviously try to revisit them from books that I read because I think that's the whole point. Shouldn't just regurgitate. Be a student of your, you know, with your belief. Be a student of, you know, of the understanding. Don't just be, oh, this guy said this, so I'm gonna say the same thing. Do your own research as well, right? So, um, so the time period of Judges begins circa, right, or around 1350 BC to around 1010 BC, right, which I believe is around maybe, I want to say around 400 years, right, 400 maybe 10 years maybe, but it depends if you include the time of Samuel as well, right, and the time of Eli too, right. So let's see if I can pull it up as well on my computer. Right. So it's lost. It says that, you know, it lasted around 400 years, 300 to 400 years, right? When it comes down to that time period of the judges, and We have I've written down the judges we have, right, and then I'm going to kind of go into showing um the archaeology outside of the biblical account that points to what is written by the scriptures, right? So we have around 14 judges. We got Othniel, Ehud, um, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, and some even put in Eli as well. Some people even put in Samuel too. But I'll get a precept on that really shows us that the judges really are, the Israelites essentially, and those that were the ruling or leaders, in that time. And that word for judge is Shabtayam, I believe it is, right? In the ancient Hebrew, it's Shapat, Shapat, which means to govern or to vindicate or to punish, right? So this is the book of Judges, chapter 1, and I'll start from verse 15. It says, So I took chief of your tribes, wise men and known, and made them heads over you, captains over thousands, and captains over hundreds, and captains over fifties, and captains over tens, and officers among your tribe. And I charged your judges at that time, saying, Hear the causes between your brethren, and judge righteously between every man and his brother, and the stranger that is with him. Ye shall not respect persons in judgment, but ye shall hear the small as well as the great. Ye shall not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is Yahweh's, and the cause that is too hard for you, bring it unto me, and I will hear it. So there was judges that were literally set up at that point in time, right, from the law that was set up to judge, uh, to decide, the outcome of a matter. Right? Even when, going into the book of Ruth, I was mentioned, right? When you read the book of Ruth, um, Boaz, he brought the elderly men to come and, judge, right? This is Ruth, the book of Ruth, chapter 4, and I'll start from verse 2. It says, And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, Sit ye down here, and they sat down. So essentially, before this matter was carried out, he said, look, he took these elders to judge the matter, right? So that, you would have a group of men, right, that would say, okay, this is the outcome on this decision. This is what should be done, right? Even when, you had the revenger of blood, you would have, I think it's the avenger of blood, I believe it's either the avenger or the revenger of blood, where somebody was, maybe accidentally killed. He would have someone that would pursue the person that, done the killing, whether it was accidental or intentional. He could pursue the person until he made it to one of these safe cities. And once he made it to the safe city, he would, they would have to judge that matter to see whether, punished or whether, the blood is washed off his hands, essentially. Right? So, see, forget reset. So this is Numbers 11, and I'll start at verse 16. It says Numbers 11 and 16. It says, And the Lord said unto Moses, Gather unto me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom thou knowest to be the elders of the people, and officers over them, and bring them unto the tabernacle of the congregation, that they may stand there with thee. Right? Verse 17, And I will come down and talk with thee there, and I will take of the spirit which is upon thee, and will put it upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with thee, that thou bear it not thyself alone. So these other men, they had the same spirit, of Moses in terms of, judging, right? Which is something, um, Moses kind of got that from his father-in-law, I believe it's Jethro, right? He kind of tells him, look, man, um, you need other people to help you judge the matter too, right? But this is Exodus 18, and I'll start from verse Exodus 18, and I'll start from verse 22. And let them judge the people at all seasons, and it shall be that every great matter they shall bring unto thee, but every small matter they shall judge. So it shall be easier for thyself, and they shall bear the burden with thee. So essentially, there were judges that were set up. That's why you had even in the law, it tells you about not reviling the gods, which are really the judges or the rulers of the people, right? This is Exodus 22 and verse 28. It says, thou shalt not revile the gods, nor curse the ruler of thy people. And the ruler of thy people would be the judges. Just like with Moses, right? Moses was a judge. Right? Moses was the one that, the Most High used him to judge Pharaoh, to judge, wicked Israelites in the wilderness, right? This is Judges. That's why Miriam was cursed, right? This is Judges, Numbers 12 and verse. This is the book of Judges, from Judges, but it says Numbers 12, and I'll start from verse. Uh, no, Numbers 12 and 8. With him, which is talking about Moses, will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches, and in the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. Wherefore then were ye not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. So, hey, the Most High got onto Miriam and Aaron and said, hold on, you can't talk on you can't talk on Moses, man. I talk to Moses, right? They kind of say, okay, doesn't God talk to us as well? At that time, right, you had what's his name? Moses was that mediator, if you want to say, right? And the message would be conveyed by him onto the people, right? And he was the meekest of them all at that point in time, right? But let's get back into the point of these judges, right? So, um, Judges, the book of Judges itself really defines Israel's failure as a theocracy, and it shows you really, so it shows you really, at that point in time where, there was just a mass apostasy, right? I'm going to go to the book of Judges, right? Chapter, you have a man, I believe his name is, I want to say, right? Judges 16, 16 or 17. That Micah, I think the man was Micah, and he robbed his mom, right? He robbed his mom, showing you the state of Israel at that time, right? This is Judges 17 and verse 1. And there was a man of Mount Ephraim whose name was Micah, and he said unto his mother, the 1100 shekels of silver that was taken from thee about which thou cursest, and spake of also in mine ears, behold, the silver is with me, I took it. And his mother said, blessed be thou of the Lord, my son. So even at that time, he knew his mom, right? He couldn't find her money, and he was the one that took it. It says, verse 3, and when he had restored the 1100 shekels of silver, to his mother said, I had wholly dedicated the silver unto the Lord from my hand for my son, to make a graven image and a molten image. Now therefore I will restore it unto thee. Yet he restored the money unto his mother, and his mother took 200 shekels of silver, and gave them to the founder, who made thereof a graven image and a molten image, and they were in the house of Micah. So they made idols with that money. But the point being is that at that time there was great apostasy, right? You know, there was idols. It tells you that he had a house full of idols, man, and then he got robbed by the tribe of Dan, right? He got robbed by the tribe of Dan, and they said, "Look, hey, you ain't gonna do nothing about that," right? He had a house full of idols, right? You know, so even to touch on the point I was saying about judges, you know, how it's accredited to Samuel. Some, you know, people will also say that it may have been a student or a disciple of Samuel's also, right? Which is this is quoted from Survey of the Old Testament by Gleason L. Archer, right? It's a book you can purchase, which goes into you know, the preservation and the writings of these books, right? Going into the authorship of these books, you know, the Khan. Um, so let's jump into it. So, firstly, first and foremost, you got the first piece of, you know, kind of archaeology, right? Because archaeology is a good way of bringing the precept. Right? What I was going to say 22, 23. Right, I told you about the ancient landmark. Tells us to not remove. Here we go. Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, chapter 23 and verse 10. It says, remove not the ancient landmark and enter not into the fields of the fatherless. Because obviously, if you remove the ancient landmark, you know, which we know Esau has done a great job, you know, at taking this part and taking that, right? You know, he's done that, right? So when it comes down to certain pieces of history, they're not, you know, where they should be, or the people aren't who they claim to be, right? Which is you know, another thing that we can see in history and how it's, you know, obviously been changed, right? So, you know, we can just go on to the point of the Armana letters, right? So there's something called the Armana letters, right? There's something called the Armana letters, right? So, and that's a piece of archaeology, right, or ancient landmark, if you want to say, or a piece of history, right? So it says the Amana letters are a collection of 382 clay tablets discovered in Egypt, dating back to around the 14th century BC, which is around 1360, right, to 1332 BC, which is around the same time period of the judges, and obviously prior to the judges, or the judges' time period, you have the conquest of Joseph. Joseph's the madness. You have the conquest of um, Joshua's conquest, you know, throughout that region, right? And it says that primarily written in Akkadian cuneiform, they contain diplomatic correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs, and it's claiming mainly Akhenaten and Amenhotep III, and rulers of the Near Eastern empires and vassal Canaanite city states. And remember, the Israelites, you know, would have been fighting against the Canaanites in that time because of that, um, you know, the land was the Canaanite before it was the Israelites, right? So it says they offer crucial insight into ancient international diplomacy, trade, and regional conflict, right? So the content of the Amana letters, it says the letters reveal a complex web of diplomacy, including gift exchanges, marriage negotiations, and pleas from vessels in the Levant, such as Tyre, Libyos, and Jerusalem, for military help against attackers known as the Habiru, right? So it says the Habiru, right? Whoever the you know, and the Habiru is not like we don't need like some kind of extensive breakdown onto potentially who the Habiru, right, or Hebrew, right, or Apiru, could be. Some scholars accredit it to them not being the Israelites, and some do. But again, this is the time period of the judges in the land or the region of Canaan, so that you know, lets you know, right? But again, we do the research, right? So that's the Amon the letters, right? Let me see if I can get a precept on that. So this is the book of Judges, chapter 1, and I'll start from verse 1, Judges 1 and 1, to kind of show that point of the wars between the Israelites and the Canaanites. It says, now after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites first to fight against them? Yeah. So the Canaanites and the Israelites, they were getting it in, right? So like, yeah. Right. So, like I was saying, it says about in Judges 1 and 1, right? It tells you, or I'll even read on, it says Judges 1 and 2. And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have delivered the land into his hand. So again, showing you, Judah being the chief tribe, um, chosen tribe, you know, reading on it says, and Judah had said unto Simeon his brother, come up with me into my lot, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I likewise will go with thee into thy lot. So Simeon went with him, and Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they slew of them in Bezek 10,000 men. Right, and I believe they took this guy's, they cut, I think they cut off his big toes, man. Right, they cut off this guy's big toes. Right, which is hey, you can't do a lot without your toes, man. Right, Adonai, I believe his name is Adonai Bezek. Right, so let me see if I can pull that as well. Right, this is uh, but I mean that's funny still, right? And remember when you read the account um of throughout the scriptures, hey, the Israelites didn't conquer the land with immediacy. When you come more into the time of David, that's really David and Solomon, that's really when Israel, has rulership over that land, and there's a lot of peace, let's say like that, right? So that's going into the Armand letters, right? Even if I go to Judges 2 and 13. No, Salakia. Judges 2 and verse. This is the book of Judges 2, and I'll start from verse 1. Well, let's go to Deuteronomy. Even when you read Deuteronomy, right, it tells you what's commanded of the children of Israel, when they come into taking the land, right? So this is Deuteronomy 7 and verse 1. It says, when the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and have cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them, and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. Right? Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son, because they would take you away from following the Most High. So literally, when we, would go into the land, you couldn't make a covenant with these people, man. right? You couldn't make a covenant and now you get with the Canaanites. You couldn't do that. So that's where when you read, you know, and it tells you, because Canaan is cursed as well, right? This is uh, back to Judges 2 and verse 2. It says, "And ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. Ye shall throw down their altars, but ye have not obeyed my voice. Why have ye done this? Therefore, I said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare unto you." Right? Let's see, maybe it's Judges 3, because it told you that, literally these nations were set up to make Israel know about war. Right? Yes, Judges 3 and verse 1. Now these are the nations which the Lord, and remember, just because it may say the word like Ephraim is a nation of its own, right? For example, like it says that Ephraim in I think Genesis 40, maybe 48, right? Or maybe I think it's 48. That he's a nation, but there will be nations of nations, paraphrasing greatly, that come from Ephraim, right? Because essentially you had when you read the book of Judges, it shows you that there were literally tribes, that were amongst, you know, um, that were amongst um these you had Ephraim. From Ephraim then he had a son, and these different people, there would be tribes that are still Ephraimites though, right? And I'll show that as well, Lord willing, right? In the end of the Judges, right? This is Judges 3 and verse 1. Now these are the nations which the Lord left to prove Israel by them, even as many of Israel as had not known all the wars of Canaan, only that the generations of the children of Israel might know to teach them war, at the least, such as before knew nothing thereof, namely the five lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Zidonians, and the Hivites that dwelt in Mount Lebanon, and Mount Baal Hermon, unto the entering in of Hamath. And they were to prove Israel by them, to know whether they would hearken unto the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. So literally showing you that point of the Amarna letters where, these Hittites, right? They were trying to reach out because they were basically getting a completely just decimated, which is what was really going on, right? They were literally asking, for help and reinforcements, so it says on, when you click on the Wikipedia for the Amarna letters, it tells you Jerusalem and the Abiru threat. It says a significant cluster of the Amarna letters, EA 285 to 290, was written by Abdi, see that? Abdi Heber, the Canaanite chieftain of Jerusalem, showing you that they were in that region before Israel. So before Israel was a state, as people claim it to be today, it wasn't even owned by them. They were, the Canaanites really had that land, right? It says referred in the tablets to Jerusalem, right? So it says Abdi Hebder repeatedly pleads with Pharaoh, likely Akhenaten, for military assistance, specifically requesting archers to defend against the Habiru, a nomadic or semi-nomadic group of marauders and mercenaries who were attacking Egyptian vessel territories throughout Canaan. So, that's showing you, look, right, that's showing you, right, Salakia. So that's literally showing you what was going on right at that time. Right. And then another one we have, right, the we have the Jerubbaal, right? We have the Jerubbaal, right? Pottery, right? So let me start pull up a picture. So Let's see. Right. So the Jerubbaal pottery inscription, which means let Baal contend, which was a name given to Gideon because he pulled down the idol which they commanded to do. Like we read in Deuteronomy. You can read that Deuteronomy 12, I think. You can read that in Deuteronomy 7 as well. About pulling down their idols, right? So this is Judges chapter 8 or 7, maybe. So this is the book of Judges, chapter 6, yeah. And I'll start from verse Judges 6, and I'll start from verse 31. And Joash, which is the father of Gideon, said unto all that stood against him, will ye plead for Baal? Will ye save him? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death whilst it is yet morning. If he be a god, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar. And the one that cast down his altar is talking about Jerubbaal, right? Which is Gideon. It says, verse 32, therefore, on that day, he called him Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal plead against him, because he hath thrown down his altar. So when you read further back in the chapter, it tells you that, Gideon, he took down that altar, right? So it tells you, I'm going to literally pull out the point. Right? So, all right, so you read this account, let me see if I don't know if it will. Yeah, so if you look here, right, this is the inscription, right, and it says written in ink in the ancient alphabetic writing upon the shard has been interpreted as Jerubbaal, right? So this here has been interpreted as Jerubbaal, right? So they're saying, is it Canaanite or Hebrew? But essentially the language of, the Canaanites and the Hebrews, is very, very similar, nonetheless, right? So that tells you about that name, Jerubbaal, which we see again mentioned in the scriptures, right? So, and that was found from around, I think it's three, three, 300 and 3010, 3000. See that? They date that to around this. Well, I got it written down. So I think 3,100 pieces, I believe, of pottery was found. Right, if I've got my notes written down correctly, right? Let me just confirm that. So their claim is that it is a 3,100-year-old pottery fragment bearing the Canaanite inscription Jerubbaal, which was discovered in 2019 at Kirbet Al Rai near Gat or Israel, and then that's dating to approximately 1,100 BCE during the biblical period of the Judges. But can't. So there's that, right? And the last one, which is quite a great one. Maybe I can pull that point up about how you had the judges, and within the judges you had within judges it shows you, because you can't get confounded and say, okay, it calls them the men of uh, the men of Gilead, right? Because the men of Gilead, you had when you look at the map, right? You have to, and that's why you have to understand the cities and where places are on the map. If you don't understand that, you're gonna see that's another place, right? But when you look at the map, right, it'll be able to tell you what cities were where, right? So when you look at Gilead is actually um, you have Ramoth Gilead, which is in the land of Manasseh, or it might tell you, for example, the men of Gilead. Obviously, keep it in context, you know. But you had Manasseh that was dwelling in that land. Same way where you have Shechem, the men of Shechem, for example, or you have, let me see if I can find an account, where it tells you about that. But there's let me see. I want to say I'll go to 13. Maybe. See that? Look, so this is Judges 11 and verse 1, right? Let me speak of that. Judges. Right? So it's always good to look at the maps to understand where was this and where was that. It's great. You have to do that. You don't do that, hey, you're gonna get confounded and you're gonna say, oh well, he's the Gileadite. What's a Gileadite? Hey, people will take on the names of the places they, abode in, right? So this is Judges 11 and 1. It says, now Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty man of valor, and he was the son of a harlot, and Gilead begat Jephthah, right? So Gilead really, going into see, but on this map they say Gilead goes back to let's see, they say it goes back to Gad, right? But point being is that in this point in time, the Israelites were in these regions, though they were, prior to that they were the Israelites. But when you start from Judges 10, it tells you, because you got to keep things in context, in terms of knowing who's who, right? But let me see if I'm good to it, right? All right, because I believe, Jephthah, he would have either been a Gadite or a Manassite, right? He would have been a Gadite or a Manassite, right? Um, right, yeah, see that? So it would have either been a Gadite or a Manassite, right? And just because his mother was a harlot or a heathen, again, you are the seed of your father, right? And again, um, so right. So again, even but there's even context because you had, I believe it's Abimelech, right? No, is it Abimelech? Yeah, you have Abimelech where he took the people, of his mother's side because his mother was a heathen, right? Took the side, of took the people that were of his mother's lineage, and he used them to kill all his brothers, right? Apart from, I believe it's Jephthah, right? Right. So let me see if I can get that. Yeah, that's when you read Judges 9, and I start from verse 1. It says, and Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem unto his mother's brethren and communed with them and with all the family of the house of his mother's father, saying, speak, I pray you, in the ears of all the men of Shechem, whether is better for you, either that all the sons of Jerubbaal, which are 70 persons, reign over you, or that one, that one reign over you. Remember also that I am your bone and flesh and your flesh. Because they were heathens, but obviously the lineage between, or the link between them, is from the side of the what? the mother. That's why he's telling them that. So the men of of Shechem there, they are heathen, right? But right, they where does it say? I'm gonna jump to uh, get this. So one of the brothers, right, of Abimelech, he got away, right? Right, when you read verse 21, right, Judges 9 and 21, and Jotham ran away and fled and went to Beer and dwelt there for fear of Abimelech, right? See that? So and he dwelt over that side, right? So let's see if I can get more, right? See if I can pull up, right? Right. Um, oh, well, I might be. Um, right. Yeah, because even that, look. So this is Judges 12, and I'll start from verse um, Judges 12, and I'll start from verse 4. Because even amongst the Israelites themselves, they had wars between each other, though they were brethren. Right, I'll start from Judges 12 and 1. And the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and went northward and said unto Jephthah, wherefore passest thou over to fight against the children? Right, so Salakia, going back to it, it says, this is Judges 12 and 1. It says, and the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and went northward, said unto Jephthah, wherefore passest thou over to fight against the children of Ammon? And didst not call us to go with thee? We will burn uh, thy house upon thee with fire. Right? I'm gonna jump down to um, verse 4. It says, then Jephthah gathered together all the men of Gilead and fought with Ephraim, and the men of Gilead smote Ephraim because they said, ye are Gileadites. Ye Gileadites are fugitives of Ephraim among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites. Right, and the Gileadites took the passages of Jordan before the Ephraimites, and it was so that when those Ephraimites which were escaped said, let me go over, that the men of Gilead said unto him, art thou an Ephraimite? If he said nay, then they said unto him, say now Shibboleth. And he said Sibboleth, for he could not frame to pronounce it right. Then they took him and slew him at the passages of Jordan, and there fell at that time of the Ephraimites 40 and 2,000. So you had there was like an in-house war between the tribes of Israel, right? Which was quite common, as again there was apostasy, right? And the last point, that we have is called the Philistine temple, which is called Tel uh, Quasli, which is over 3,000 years old. and matches the description of the temple which was destroyed by Samson, right? So when you can type in that cell, right, that cell crusty temple, right, so the image. And so if you look there, right, it shows the pillars, right, of right, the two pillars of what was destroyed, right? So there's the two pillars, right? That they're saying that this is the temple which we read about in the scriptures, right? So going to that point, let's read that account and we'll close up on that. So this is Judges 16, and I'll start from verse number 29. And Samson took hold of the two middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was borne up, of the one with his right hand and of the other with his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. So that's showing you, just like I showed the archaeology of that, of what had taken place, man. Like, literally, you know, matching the description of what's, taught by the scripture. So that's the archaeology, you know, behind, the judges and the historic figures. Lord willing, this will be a continued series to kind of keep up. But all praise to the Most High with that. I'll say, Shalom, Yahweh, Shalom, Shalom, Shalom.